Well, tonight, Duluth City Councilors unanimously approved a plan to kickstart development in the heart of the city. The organization Downtown Duluth recently unveiled its 5-year plan for breathing new life into the heart of the city called Imagine Downtown. The vote also includes an amendment to include climate emergency and resilience language. One of the goals of the plan is to build more than 1,000 new housing units. The city and partners must identify, prepare, and market spaces that are vacant and then hand those spaces over to developers for construction. While the creation of new housing is still a big work in progress, some parts of the Imagine Downtown plan are already underway, like First Street Fridays in the summer to help highlight downtown businesses.